What would you do if a wealthy, lonely billionaire asked you to be his date for a day? When Rosa, a humble cleaner, agreed to an unusual request, she had no idea it would change both their lives forever. Let's begin. Mr. Spencer was a man who had everything, or so it seemed. His mansion was enormous, with golden chandeliers, grand staircases, and rooms so large that footsteps echoed for miles. Yet despite all his riches, he was alone. His sickness had drained his energy and hope, and as he sat by his window each day, staring at the world outside, he realized that money couldn't buy the one thing he truly wanted: company. In the shadows of this grand home was Rosa. She was a kind woman, always busy cleaning, dusting, and tidying the massive house. She moved quietly, unnoticed, like a gentle breeze that passed through the halls. Mr. Spencer rarely spoke to her, and she was used to that. To her, he was just her employer, a distant figure in the background of her daily routine. But one day, something very strange happened. Mr. Spencer called Rosa to his sitting room. She stood nervously by the door, clutching the cleaning rag in her hand. She had never been summoned like this before. "Rosa," he said, his voice weak but kind, "I have a strange request to make." She blinked, unsure of what he was about to ask. "Would you be my date for a day?" Rosa's eyes widened in shock. Her, a date. She was just a cleaner. She looked at Mr. Spencer, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't there before: a deep sadness, a loneliness that seemed to weigh on him like the sickness that was slowly taking over his body. "Why me?" she whispered, barely able to speak. Mr. Spencer sighed, looking out the window. "I don't have anyone left, Rosa. No family, no friends. I just want one last happy memory before it's too late." Rosa didn't know what to say. Her heart was racing. The idea was completely ridiculous, but she also felt a pang of sympathy for the old man. How could someone so rich be so alone? That night, Rosa couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Mr. Spencer's request. Her friends warned her that it might be a bad idea. "He's rich and powerful. What if people think you're taking advantage of him?" they said. But deep inside, Rosa felt something different. She had seen the loneliness in his eyes, and it reminded her of the times she had felt invisible too. Rosa arrived at the mansion early in the morning, feeling nervous about the strange day ahead. When she knocked on the door, a maid greeted her and led her to a room she had never been in before. Inside, laid out on the bed, was the most beautiful dress she had ever seen, sparkling and elegant, with shimmering fabric that seemed to glow under the soft light. Next to it were matching shoes and a delicate necklace. For a moment, Rosa hesitated. This wasn't her world. She was just a cleaner. But today, for some reason she didn't fully understand, Mr. Spencer wanted her to step into his world, even if only for a day. With trembling hands, she put on the dress and jewelry. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She felt like a princess in a fairy tale. When she went downstairs, Mr. Spencer was waiting in a wheelchair by the grand entrance. His illness had made him weak, but when he saw her, his tired eyes lit up. "You look wonderful," he said, smiling warmly. Rosa blushed, feeling shy. "Thank you," she whispered. With the help of his driver, Mr. Spencer and Rosa set off to a fancy restaurant in the city. It was the kind of place Rosa had only seen in movies: tall ceilings, chandeliers, and waiters dressed in suits. As they entered, Rosa noticed everyone's eyes on them. People whispered and stared, confused by the sight of the wealthy, frail man with a young woman who was clearly out of place. Rosa felt their judgmental gazes like needles against her skin. She wanted to shrink away, but Mr. Spencer gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't mind them," he said softly, his voice filled with kindness. "Tonight is about us." As they sat down, the tension began to melt away. Mr. Spencer, who was usually quiet and reserved, started sharing stories from his past. He talked about how he had built his empire, how hard he worked to become rich. But as he spoke, Rosa could hear the sadness in his voice. "I spent my whole life chasing after money," he confessed, looking down at the table. "I thought it would make me happy. But I lost people along the way. People I loved." Rosa listened quietly, feeling her heart soften. She understood, in her own way, what it meant to sacrifice things for survival. She shared her story with him. How she had to leave school early to take care of her younger siblings. How she worked day and night just to provide for them. "I've always felt like life was a battle," she said. "A battle I'm always losing." For the first time, they spoke to each other not as a billionaire and a cleaner, but as two people who had both suffered in different ways. As the evening wore on, Rosa began to feel more comfortable. But not everyone in the restaurant was as kind. From across the room, Mr. Spencer's old business friends were watching them, whispering to each other. One of them, a tall man in a dark suit, walked over to their table. Well, Spencer," the man said with a fake smile. "I didn't expect to see you out tonight, and with such interesting company." Rosa's face burned with embarrassment, but Mr. Spencer didn't flinch. He smiled politely but said nothing. The man smirked and walked away, leaving a cloud of tension behind him. Rosa wanted to leave. She could feel the eyes of the other guests judging her, wondering why someone like her was dining in a place like this with a man like Mr. Spencer. But before she could say anything, she noticed Mr. Spencer growing pale. His hands were trembling, and his breathing became labored. He tried to hide it, but Rosa could tell he wasn't feeling well. "Mr. Spencer," she whispered urgently, "are you okay?" He nodded slightly, but Rosa could see the pain in his eyes. They quickly finished their meal and left the restaurant. As they drove back to the mansion, the mood had shifted. Rosa's heart was heavy with worry. Mr. Spencer had tried to make the day special, but now it seemed like something was terribly wrong. As soon as they arrived at the mansion, Mr. Spencer motioned for Rosa to follow him inside. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes made it clear that he had something important to share. They went into the grand sitting room, where Mr. Spencer slowly sat down on a large velvet chair by the fireplace. Rosa stood nearby, unsure of what to do. The room was dimly lit, with only the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. "Rosa," Mr. Spencer began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something you need to know." Rosa felt her heart skip a beat. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on him as he struggled to find the words. "I haven't been completely honest with you," he said, looking away. "You see, there's a reason I asked you to be with me today. It's not just because I'm lonely." Rosa's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to understand what he meant. What else could it be? Mr. Spencer looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Years ago, I made a terrible mistake, one that I can never undo. I had a family, Rosa, a wife and a daughter, but I lost them because I chose my business, my money over them." His voice cracked as he spoke, and Rosa could see the pain etched across his face. "My wife left me, and my daughter. She disappeared. I tried to find her, but I couldn't. I spent years searching, but it was too late. I lost everything that really mattered, all because I thought wealth would make me happy." Rosa's heart ached for him. She had always seen Mr. Spencer as a distant figure, a powerful man who had everything. But now she saw the truth. He was just a broken man, filled with regret and sorrow. "I asked you to spend the day with me," he continued, his voice trembling, "because in some way, you remind me of her. My daughter. The way you care for others, the way you've worked so hard your whole life, sacrificing so much. I see her in you." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. She had never expected this. She had never imagined that her simple, quiet presence could mean so much to someone like him. She felt overwhelmed, unsure of what to say. "Mr. Spencer," she began, her voice shaking, "I'm so sorry." But before she could finish, Mr. Spencer suddenly gasped, clutching his chest. His face twisted in pain, and he slumped forward in the chair. "Mr. Spencer," Rosa cried, rushing to his side. She grabbed his hand, her heart pounding in panic. "Someone, help!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the halls. Within moments, the mansion staff rushed in, and an ambulance was called. Rosa stayed by his side, holding his hand tightly, as they waited for help to arrive. Tears streamed down her face, and her mind raced with fear. Would he make it? Was this the last time she would see him? As the paramedics arrived and carried him away, Rosa stood frozen, her heart heavy with worry. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him now, not after everything they had shared. But as she watched the ambulance drive away, one question lingered in her mind. What happens next? Mr. Spencer lay motionless in the hospital bed, his pale face barely visible beneath the tubes and monitors surrounding him. The beeping of the machines was the only sound in the cold, sterile room. Rosa sat quietly by his side, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had never felt so helpless. The doctors had told her that his condition was critical. His heart was weak, and there wasn't much more they could do but wait. Rosa's mind was filled with worry. She thought of all the things Mr. Spencer had shared with her about his past, his regrets, and his missing daughter. She wondered if he would ever get a chance to make things right. Suddenly, the door to the hospital room creaked open. Rosa turned to see a tall woman standing in the doorway, her face half hidden beneath the brim of a large hat. Her eyes, however, were sharp, focused on the figure lying in the bed. "Who are you?" Rosa asked, standing up slowly. There was something familiar about the woman, but Rosa couldn't place it. "I'm Clara," the woman said, her voice cold but trembling slightly. "I'm his daughter." Rosa's heart skipped a beat. Clara. The daughter Mr. Spencer had been searching for all these years, the same daughter he had lost when he chose his business over his family. Rosa had imagined this moment many times, but now that Clara was standing before her, it felt unreal. "You're his daughter," Rosa whispered, still trying to process the information. "He's been looking for you for so long." Clara stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving her father. "I know," she said quietly. "I heard about his illness through one of his old friends. That's the only reason I'm here." Rosa could sense the bitterness in her voice. Clara had come, but it wasn't out of love. It was out of obligation, maybe even curiosity. She wasn't ready to forgive. "Not yet. Why didn't you come sooner?" Rosa asked softly. Clara's expression hardened. "Why should I? He's the one who left us. He's the one who chose money over me and my mother. He never cared about us then. Why should I care about him now?" Rosa felt a pang of sadness. She understood Clara's pain, but she also knew how deeply Mr. Spencer regretted his choices. He had spent years searching for her, filled with guilt and sorrow. He had told Rosa that he wished he could go back and change everything. But was it too late? "He's not the same man," Rosa said gently, stepping closer to Clara. "He's changed. He regrets everything. I've seen it in his eyes, in the way he talks about you. He's sorry, Clara. He's sorry for everything." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice breaking. "He abandoned us. My mother died heartbroken because of him. How am I supposed to just forgive him?" Rosa didn't have an answer. She could feel the weight of Clara's pain, the years of anger and resentment that had built up. But she also knew that deep down, Clara still cared. Why else would she have come? "Maybe he doesn't deserve forgiveness," Rosa said quietly. "But he's still your father, and he doesn't have much time left." Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering between her father and Rosa. After a long moment, she took a deep breath. "I'll see him," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but I'm not promising anything." With her heart pounding, Rosa stepped aside as Clara approached the hospital bed. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of the past. Clara stood by her father's side, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She looked down at him, her face a mix of anger, sadness, and something Rosa couldn't quite name. You don't even know I'm here, do you? Clara whispered, her voice filled with bitterness. After all these years, you probably forgot about me. To Rosa's surprise, Mr. Spencer's eyes fluttered open. He was weak, barely able to speak, but when he saw Clara, his face softened. Tears welled up in his eyes. Clara, he whispered, his voice raspy. Is it really you? Clara's lip trembled, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at the man who had once been her father. I'm so sorry, Mr. Spencer choked out, tears streaming down his face. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I failed you and your mother. But I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped loving you. Clara's anger boiled over. You loved us. You loved us so much that you left us behind to chase your money and your business, she shouted, her voice shaking. Do you know what it was like for us? Do you even care? Mr. Spencer sobbed softly, his hand reaching out for hers. I was wrong, he whispered. I was so wrong, and I've paid for it every day since you left. Please, don't leave me again. Not like this. Clara's face crumpled, her emotions crashing over her like a wave. Rosa stood quietly, watching as the moment she had feared finally arrived. It was raw, heartbreaking, and painful. For a moment, it seemed like there was no way forward, that the pain of the past would drown out any chance of reconciliation. But then, Clara did something Rosa hadn't expected. She took a deep breath and, with tears in her eyes, reached out and gently took her father's hand. I'm still angry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I'm here. The next morning, Clara sat by the hospital window, staring out at the rising sun. She had barely slept. The weight of everything, the past, the anger, the words spoken in the night, pressed heavily on her chest. She hadn't expected to feel this way, torn between the life she had lived without her father and the man lying in the hospital bed, weakened by illness and guilt. Rosa sat quietly across the room, watching Clara's internal struggle unfold. She knew what needed to happen, but couldn't force it. The decision to forgive had to come from Clara's heart. After what seemed like hours, Clara finally spoke, her voice soft and uncertain. I don't know if I can forgive him, Rosa, she whispered, not turning away from the window. But I can't let him go without hearing him out. Rosa nodded, her heart filled with hope. It's not about forgetting what happened, she said gently. But sometimes it's about understanding that people change. He's not the same man who made those choices. Clara stood up, taking a deep breath. Her heart was still heavy, but there was something else there now. A glimmer of resolve. She quietly made her way to Mr. Spencer's room, leaving Rosa to wait outside. Inside the room, Clara sat by her father's bedside. His eyes opened weakly, barely able to focus, but when he saw her, a faint smile crossed his lips. I thought you wouldn't come back, he whispered, his voice thin and raspy. Clara looked down, her emotions swirling. I wasn't sure I would. Mr. Spencer's hand trembled as he reached out, trying to hold hers. I know I don't deserve it, Clara, he said, tears forming in his eyes. I've spent every day of my life regretting what I did to you and your mother. Losing you was the worst mistake I've ever made. Clara swallowed hard, the anger she had held for so long softening slightly as she saw the raw pain in his face. She had waited years for this. An apology, an acknowledgement of the hurt he had caused. I was so angry at you, she said, her voice breaking. For so long, I hated you for choosing money over us. I didn't want to hear your excuses. I have no excuses, Mr. Spencer replied, his voice filled with remorse. All I have is the truth, that I was a fool. I thought money would bring me happiness, but it only took away the people I loved most. I've lived with that regret every single day. Tears filled Clara's eyes, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the pain, not just the anger. You hurt us, Dad, she whispered. But maybe it's time to let that go. Mr. Spencer's face softened, his eyes glistening with tears. I don't deserve your forgiveness, But I'm grateful you're here. It means more to me than you'll ever know." Clara squeezed his hand, and for the first time, the rift between them began to close. Later that day, Rosa visited the room, watching from a distance as Clara and Mr. Spencer talked quietly, the tension between them slowly fading. Rosa couldn't help but feel a warmth in her heart. She had seen the pain and regret in Mr. Spencer's eyes and the anger in Clara's. But now, there was healing. Over the next few days, Clara and her father spent as much time together as they could, sharing stories, memories, and regrets. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds that wouldn't heal overnight. But it was a start. Mr. Spencer, growing weaker with each passing day, called Rosa into the room one evening. "I've made my decision," he said softly, his eyes looking at both Rosa and Clara. "I want to leave everything to you, Clara. The estate, the business, everything. I want you to have the life you deserve." But Clara shook her head. "I don't want the money, Dad," she said firmly. "It's not what I came back for." Mr. Spencer looked confused. "But it's all I have to give." Clara glanced at Rosa, and a small smile crossed her lips. "No, it's not. What you've given me is the chance to heal, to find peace after all these years, and that's more valuable than any fortune." She paused, her eyes softening as she spoke. "Instead of keeping the money, I want to use it to help people like Rosa, people who work hard and never get the chances they deserve. I want your legacy to be about kindness, not wealth." Mr. Spencer's eyes filled with tears. "You've grown into such a wise woman, Clara," he whispered. "I don't deserve you." Rosa stood quietly, her heart full. She had never expected her life to take this turn, but somehow she felt that she had gained something precious, a new sense of purpose, and perhaps a family in Clara and Mr. Spencer. In the days that followed, Mr. Spencer's health worsened, and it became clear that he didn't have much time left. On his final night, Rosa and Clara sat by his side, holding his hands as he drifted away peacefully. His last moments were filled with love, forgiveness, and the knowledge that he had made peace with his past. As the days passed, Clara and Rosa set into motion the plans they had discussed with Mr. Spencer. They used his wealth to create a foundation that helped struggling families, people who worked tirelessly like Rosa, but needed a hand to rise above their circumstances. The foundation became a beacon of hope, and as they worked together, Clara and Rosa formed a deep bond. They had both been changed by Mr. Spencer's last wish, brought together by an unlikely friendship and a shared desire to make the world a better place. Rosa, no longer just a cleaner, had found her worth and her voice, realizing that her kindness and strength had the power to change lives, including her own. Mr. Spencer had left behind a legacy, not of wealth, but of love, kindness, and second chances. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. If you enjoy this heartwarming story of redemption, forgiveness, and unexpected friendships, don't miss out on more captivating tales. Subscribe now for more emotional, suspenseful stories that will keep you hooked from start to finish.